right. Thank you, Harshitha, for taking the time to speak with me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation and hearing about your experience, which I already know a little bit about, but I'm sure I'm going to learn some new and exciting things with you today.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to be here and to, just be a part of something that I honestly believe so much in.
Well, I know that more than most. We've had so many conversations about music education, and just to get things started, can you tell us just about your career in music?
Sure. So, as you know, my name is Harshitha Krishnan, and my family is Indian, South Indian, specifically Tamil. But I actually grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, and spent 17 years there. And I went to an international school that didn't really have a music program, but I was very lucky that Lagos, being a large metropolitan center, had a conservatory there. So I started taking lessons at the conservatory when I was about six-ish, maybe seven. But even before that, I started learning music at home. My mom took lessons her whole childhood, Carnatic music, and on veena. I don't know if you know that instrument, but it's like a sitar but bigger. And yeah, it's an extremely technical instrument, and that's the instrument my mom grew up playing. So she used to teach my brother and I just like songs and stuff like that. So it was very informal. But it was, very, very formative for me because it started off the music culture in our family for me, especially growing up outside of India and far away from the rest of my family. It was important that my mom was able to sort of like keep that alive for like the four of us, my dad, my brother, my mom, and I. So yeah, she started teaching us Carnatic music songs. Apparently, I used to run around her in circles while she sang to me, and I would just absorb during my run. But yeah, I was then sort of like discovered in school at the age of four, and somebody called my mom and was just like, "Hey, I don't know if you know this, but your daughter can actually sing, and you should do something about it." So I was just kind of like thrust into European classical music at the conservatory at that point because my mom was like, okay, maybe my skills are not sufficient to nurture this talent in her. So I learned to play recorders, soprano, alto, tenor recorders. And I did that for 12 years. I was actually very good. I was a concert recorder player. But I also learned to sing. I learned to sight read. And it was a wonderful experience, but I always felt like with classical music, that mindset of, the best music and the greatest music in the world has already been written. And we're all just trying to sort of figure out how to perform it well. And at some point when I was a teenager, I started to feel kind of like a little rebellious. I wanted to sing more pop music. I wanted to sing more contemporary Indian music, film music that I was listening to. And so my mom decided, you know what, you've never grown up in India. Why don't you just go to India for college? So I moved to India when I was 18, moved in with my grandparents, and while I was doing my liberal arts degree, I kind of just very luckily fell into a crowd of up-and-coming musicians who embraced me, and we started touring, and I was in the studio 4 or 5 days a week. I had residencies at different restaurants and clubs that I was performing at constantly. So it felt like I was doing music with college on the side. But yeah, at that point, I learned about Berkeley, and I was fascinated as soon as I learned about it and decided, okay, if I want to take my skill to the next level, this is something I have to do. in India, although I had a lot of really great opportunities as a female musician, especially as a female singer, I was facing a lot of this, obviously, sexism. So I was getting paid less than male musicians. I was getting sort of typecast in the kinds of music I was going to be allowed to do professionally. And I also was just constantly reminded that because I don't have like harmonic knowledge or knowledge of other like harmonic instruments, I should just stand up front and look pretty and do my job and let the professionals do their job. So I wanted to sort of gain the expertise that it would take for me to match up, because I didn't really know what the value of my skill sets as they were. But yeah, I came to Berkeley and I had an incredible experience learning music from all over the world, which I never thought about. I thought I was going to come to Berkeley and I was going to learn jazz and just American music, but I learned so much about different cultures and different world music styles. And what I think is truly amazing is that now what I do is kind of like find a way to marry those different styles within a sort of a framework that doesn't really have a name yet. We kind of define it as like fusion or avant-garde inspired or like something inspired. It doesn't have a name yet. So it's cool to be part of something that's in the making. It feels like it's in the making. It feels like it's in those early stages. And it's all because of the opportunity that I had to, again, just the privilege of being able to come to Berkeley on a scholarship and, just be in this kind of like breeding ground of creativity from all over the world. And that's where we met. So, again, those connections that I made at Berkeley continue to give back to me in ways that I never imagined, and just incredibly grateful.
Yeah, me too. I can relate very much to everything that you said right there at the end, especially the idea that we're kind of in the transition period of experiencing all these new styles of music as they're being created, that they don't even have a name. They're very hard to be defined because they're mixing so many things that were not mixed over hundreds of years. There were styles and traditions that mostly existed within their own spaces and now have started to become mixed together. And like you were saying before too, that there are people that would say, oh, well, the great music has already been written and now we're learning how much there is still to be written and how much there is to be done.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, like you said from a really young age, you were being exposed to Carnatic music in Nigeria, which to my knowledge, I would not expect it to be a very prevalent
No, it's not. It's not.
Music that you would hear. So first, I'm curious to know like how that felt to you, learning a style of music that like, did your friends know what it was? Did you talk to your friends about that kind of music, or was it something that kind of was more within your family nucleus?
Yeah, it was definitely a weird thing for most of the people who I was around, because again, I went to an Indian international school, but that doesn't, India is, oftentimes confused as like kind of like a monolith or whatever, but every single state used to be its own country. It has its own language, it has its own way of practicing religion, it has its own cultural practices, it has its own clothing. And so when you talk about an Indian international school in a foreign country, you have to understand that it's everybody, like literally everybody. So there's no two people who speak the same language or even the same dialect oftentimes in the same class. So our common language is English. And we're growing up in a country that was also colonized by the British. So in some ways, it's still kind of like reinforcing colonial ideas and colonial ways of being. But yeah, and so like this Carnatic music thing seemed like such a, okay, cool. That's like a weird thing to do, I guess. For most of my classmates, it was not something that they had ever heard before. And it was something that was encouraged in the temple. So a lot of Carnatic music is religious. And so it's oftentimes performed in the presence of God or at the temple itself. And so my mom would be like, okay, we're going to go to the temple for this puja, which is like a ceremony that celebrates a particular god or something. And she would immediately thrust me forward and be like, okay, go sing. Go sing the song that I taught you last week, kind of deal. And, the other adults who grew up in India, they're the ones who are like, oh, wow, this girl can really sing. And like, they're the ones who are encouraging me. But their kids have no idea what's going on. Right? So like among my peers, I was very much another in that. And so there was like this little bit of resistance of like, none of these people understand what I'm doing. Do I have to do it? Like, can't I do something cooler? But for my mom, it was very important. For my parents, and even my grandparents in India, it was important because it's a part of our culture for kids to have a musical education, which I'm very grateful for now. But it certainly made me distance myself from it for the longest time because, one, it wasn't cool. Two, as I was getting older and like getting deeper into European classical music, I felt like I had so much more expertise and depth of knowledge in that. And I was also, over my summers in India, my first cousin is a professional Carnatic musician. And I was like watching him practice and improvise and things like that and perform. And I knew that I knew so little that it was I felt like it was a negligible amount of knowledge that I kind of like buried it. I was embarrassed at how little I knew. And it wasn't until I actually came to Berkeley that I felt like I had permission to sort of reference that historical content that I had like kind of internalized over time. Yeah, it's interesting. Music education, especially Eurocentric and a lot of other classical styles, are very kind of like still hierarchical and like you have to gain a certain expertise in order to do this and this and this and this. It's all very level-based and testing-based, which are actually relatively arbitrary. It's like it's all some individual who's deciding whether you have enough knowledge about something or not. So, I felt like I finally had enough expertise in music in general that I gave myself the permission, or I felt safe enough to explore what I had basically been absorbing my whole life.
It sounds to me really interesting, like that idea of feeling like you know very little about something. The way I would perceive it in this conversation comes off more as like humility more than self-doubt or self-criticism. But I'm sure that there's like some mixture of all those things going on that obviously, especially when we're younger, we compare ourselves to other people, or we compare what we're doing with music with other forms of music, and having this whole hierarchy like you're saying. But I do think also there's truth to that when you're learning about something that is so rich, that has so much to learn about, like whether it's Carnatic music or any other style of music, that people don't even realize how deep they are because of how powerful Western European classical music is on a global scale, that it's almost anywhere you go, it's being taught. Yep. That people think, oh, that just because it's so ubiquitous means that's the only thing that's really deep and really...
Yeah, it's like it must be so great, and that's why it's transcended all these cultures or whatever. But really what it is colonialism.
Mm.
You know,
Exactly.
that's really what created the spread of and the dissemination of that musical style. And what I think part of the, you said that it sounds like humility to you, but it's also very integral to that doubt, that self-doubt is is a very huge part of being a third culture kid. If you ever talk to other third culture kids, there's always this little bit of like, yeah, I'm this, but it's not really exactly that. Like for me, the example is when I moved to India, on the surface, everybody was like, oh, yeah, just another Indian kid. But as soon as I opened my mouth, they were like, oh, you have an accent. And then they start to question, they're like, do you have an accent because you're rich and you think you've watched a lot of like American TV or British TV and that's why you have an accent, or are you actually not from here? Right? And then as a musician, you observe, you listen a lot, you are constantly absorbing nuances in musical performances. And I use those skills to basically absorb the accent, the prose of conversation, the emphasis, the kinds of humor that people were, sort of emulating. But as soon as somebody said something like, oh, yeah, remember when we were kids and there was that thing that we used to get at the store, blah, 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 I'm like, no idea. Or they ask you a question of like, oh, yeah, which school did you go to? You seem like somebody who went to this school or blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, so, there's always this otherness that's deeply a part of you. No matter what you do, you're never going to be, nor should we ever strive to be really a totality of any one thing. But at that point, when you're young and impressionable, you just feel like, oh my God. My first year of college, everybody called me Africa. That was like the defining character for them. They obviously then realized, oh, there's so much more to this girl than the fact that she grew up in Africa. But yeah, that's like a very normal thing for people to do, to try to categorize people, and you try to categorize yourself, because I think that's what's made sense so far. But as you become a more complex individual, you realize that those boxes make less sense. Again, as a child, it's very simple, right? It's like good and bad. I like this, I don't like this. And then, as you get older and older, the spectrum of like and dislike widens so far. And then you have like all of these things that fall within that spectrum. And it's the same thing with your personality and, how you categorize yourself and compare yourself with others. But there's like so much uncertainty about whether you are Indian enough or Nigerian enough, or now American enough, that, I feel like music was just another way in which I felt like maybe I wasn't enough or I was too much of something else.
Yeah, it's a two-sided situation. Like, it's impossible to say it's just positive takeaways or only negative takeaways. I think it's really interesting, the idea that for you also music, you said, was a way to be able to connect with people from different places, from knowing the accents, the way of speech, the mannerisms, and all of that is a really powerful thing for anybody to have. I think it's a really necessary skill, regardless of whether you've lived in multiple cultures or if you've lived in primarily one for most of your life. Just having that ability to look beyond these boxes that are taught to us from a young age, and to realize just because most of the people around you fit this checkbox, and this checkbox, that doesn't mean every new person that comes into your life that looks
is going to fit in the same way. Yeah, for sure. And the same can be said about, like, again, when I said every third culture kid has that level of, sort of uncertainty of like where they really belong and things like that. Um, the other side of it is that we also can see ourselves being anywhere and with anybody. And we approach life with a certain amount of confidence in being able to connect with anyone, pretty much, because our upbringing was so specific and non-specific at the same time. It has left a lot of room for openness and just, oh, I'm curious now. Let me ask some more questions. Which, I think it's so funny. The older I get, I still feel like a child because I still have that approach. When I meet somebody, I'm automatically like, oh, wow, look at that. Would you mind if I asked you some questions about this? I'm just generally always curious and impressed by just how diverse people are. Like, you can tick the same 4 boxes as someone else and still have a completely unique experience and perspective on life. And that's amazing.
Yeah, that is, and it's something to be celebrated. And I think music is a really great place to be able to celebrate those. Differences sometimes is the case, but sometimes it's just variations. We're all just slightly different variations of maybe the same thing in one way or another, depending on how you look at it. It's like we're the same because we are both X, Y, or Z, but then we have these slightly different variants, which in some cases are more noticeable, in some cases less noticeable, more significant, less significant. So I'm curious, just to shift a little bit the topic. So you grew up with Carnatic music being a really big part of your musical surroundings, and then you were in a conservatory which had Western European classical music as kind of the predominant driving force around you. So I'm curious if you can remember a point, at any point in your life, where you heard a new style of music that was not one of those two, either Carnatic or Western European classical music, where you heard it for the first time and it had an impact on you that you can remember.
What's interesting is that growing up in Nigeria, I had grown up around the sounds of like Nigerian music my whole life without actually even registering it. And I think I remember one specific moment of like, I was on my way home from school. I was probably like 7 or 8. And we were stuck in traffic. And we were going by this marketplace. And there were these 4 visually impaired men who were playing rhythms on like pots and pans. For money. And I was just like, it was such a comforting sound for me because I'd grown up around that sound for so long. But there was like an immediate consciousness of like, wow, this is really something like I never hear in Indian music or in European music or in the American music that I was, then exposed to on like MTV and stuff. I was like, this is so different. And I, immediately in my head started to try to remember what this is going to sound like so I could break it down when I got home and figure out what was being done. And that basically, again, just being in the presence of, it's not even like I was interacting directly with the music, but being in the presence of, and you can hear something your entire life but never really listen to it. And until you do, and then you're like, whoa, this is like a new and a different style of music, and I kind of want to learn it. So, even now as an adult, I feel like I still listen to Nigerian music because it's so comforting to me. So even though I don't perform it, that sort of recognition of like, this is something that I grew up with and it exists in some part of me. And at some point, if I want to pull it out of my body and like manifest that in music that I'm making, I could do that. But it's still like, it's like a passive existence for me, which is still so important. So yeah.
I love that. I mean, I'm going to quote that, what you just said, that you can hear something your whole life and not listen to it is such a beautiful way of explaining such a really complicated concept, and something that I think most people have never felt at all. So to even understand it intellectually versus understanding it on an internal emotional level, I think is really hard. That, like, there's all these analogies that I've read or heard about where it's like if you're a fish swimming in water, you don't realize that you're in water and that the water is what's giving you the ability to breathe and survive and exist. It's just, that's just your environment. But if you take the fish out of the water and put it somewhere else where there's not water, then all of a sudden they realize, oh, something's wrong. And then maybe they start thinking about, okay, maybe I need to be in water. But even still, that analogy it doesn't really cut to the core of what it is with something like music or something like sound, that you're just always hearing the things that are around you in whatever culture you are. If you're walking into a supermarket, what kind of music are they playing? Or if you're
it's like a passive part of you.
Taxi.
Yeah, it's a passive part of you. Your body is still kind of like absorbing it. And it's only when you experience the absence of it that you realize how important and integral that is to you and your sort of your existence.
Yeah, I love that. So one of the last questions before we start to wrap up is, how has your entire experience with music throughout your life benefited you in ways that are not directly related to your career as a musician?
So, I think music has been a wonderful gateway for me to understanding different groups of people, right? To witness those visually impaired men playing rhythmic instruments. Again, it's not pitched, so they don't have to rely on the placement of their fingers on any particular pitch indicator, like a string or a key or anything like that. But they understand high, low, mid sort of like sounds and can create grooves by just like hitting surfaces. And me being able to sort of like understand that, like, wow, you can find a way, regardless of your ability level and your education level, to create sound that can affect someone else and be a part of them for the rest of their lives. It's really, I mean, I don't think they ever considered that possibility, and I don't think I ever consciously thought about that at that age either, but I'm realizing it now. So I think again, like I don't directly interact with Nigerian folk music in my music practice as a professional, but the lessons that it has taught me in empathy, in being curious about another style of music, and finding comfort in something that's different than me but still the same. It's something that I've heard from a young age. It's deeply important. We are obviously having this conversation with the lens of arts education and how this could impact young minds, having access to different styles of music and different people. Being at Berkeley, for example, I had the opportunity to be in the Balkan choir, for example. And now the Balkans are like a large region that encompass so many countries and their languages. And learning songs from each individual country helped me understand just how similar they were, but also just how different they were. So to be able to see an entire community as like not a monolith, like just because they are the Balkans doesn't mean they are all the same. It was a beautiful experience to learn that through music, because music is something that I consider so comforting to me. It's something that I do very well. So as opposed to having some intellectual conversation about here where the borders are and here's the language they speak and this is the kind of food they eat and like blah, blah, blah. Music is such a subtle way to introduce It's such a powerful but subtle way to introduce differences and commonalities between cultures that's enjoyable, that is engaging. It's not overly intellectual. It is felt. It is emotional. You get to then express your emotions through those people's music. Yeah, I don't think I had as much empathy, and I could have been as open as I am if it weren't for experiences like that. To find myself being moved to tears when I'm singing a song about a mother who is separated from her child in times of war. I have never experienced that. No one in my family has ever experienced that. But to sort of like be singing a song about that, even as like just a part of a choir. Actually, a part of the choir is what really makes it. It's like you're all vocalists, you're singing a cappella, you're singing this song about this particular incident. You're just so moved by the collective emotion of all of the people who are producing this song in that moment. It's so beautiful. You can't intellectualize it, really. It's an experience. It's so organic. And especially when all of your voices are blending so beautifully, you're like, wow, we came from like the furthest corners of the world, and we learned this song about this one thing, and now we're all kind of like experiencing this emotion together. Yeah, like what better way is there? Like you can't, obviously world leaders have a hard time getting into a conference room together, but what if we all just got together to sing a song together,
I love that.
It's crazy. And I wish I had access to that as a younger kid, but I also don't think that I would have appreciated it quite as much. But again, like I said about the Nigerian music, it's there. And it kind of like, it's a touchstone moment for me when I meet somebody new from a different culture. I'm like, wow, I may never sing this song again, but it's now a part of me to recognize something new and something different, and for me to have empathy and pride over, the fact that like I have touched something that has come from somewhere else. I don't need to travel the world in order to have experienced something from that place. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and it's an accessible, organic, powerful way of having shared experience that is almost like a cultural icebreaker, is what I was thinking about as you were speaking. That it's something, it's like you were saying, subtle, it's easy, it's able to be felt and not necessarily spoken about. It's not like a PowerPoint presentation that you'll get bored looking at, but it's something that you feel with other people, that you are talking about this one particular song which maybe you learned many years ago, but it still comes to your mind in this kind of a conversation, which means it's still with you in some way, even if it's not something you're talking or thinking about every single day. And the fact that it's broken the ice, so to speak, on your connection with that region and your knowledge of how diverse it is and similar in other ways is what allows for other conversations to happen down the line. You become more curious, more interested, to talk with people, to learn more, to find out more about the history, to find out more about the food, to find out more about whatever it is that anyone as an individual is driven by. It's a really great icebreaker.
Yeah. Like, for example, I have, there was a Romanian song that I learned when I was a part of the Balkan Choir ensemble at Berkeley. And I've obviously never sung it again. It was a part of that performance and whatever. But years later, I was in an Uber, and my driver had an accent, and I was just kind of like, so where's home for you? And he said, oh, Romania. And I was just like, oh, I I know a Romanian song. And he was like, no. And I just like quickly like pulled that out of my brain and I sang it for him. And he was just like, how do you know this song? This is like a really popular song that like we teach kids in school and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, I took a class and I learned this song, and it immediately, he went from like a grumpy Uber driver to this just like, talking to me about his life, his kids, and like what brought him to America. And like, it was, yeah, it's been beautiful. I do that like almost every time I'm in an Uber with somebody, and I sense that they're kind of like having maybe a bad day or like a whatever. I take that extra step, and because I've had so many experiences from so many different parts of the world, I invariably have some way of making a connection with these people. And it makes them feel seen, it makes them feel heard, it makes me feel better that I made them feel that way. I maybe learned something new about that culture that I didn't know even, through the music. Yeah, it's so cool.
I love that story. I think that's a really great place to wrap up, since it's just makes you feel nice. Using music as an opportunity to make someone's day, to connect with them, learn about their life. I think that's...
Yeah, and like I now really love that I get to do that in the classroom as, as a professor at Berkeley. I'm like, I feel like even more sort of like empowered to create that for like different groups of students. I love watching them hang out outside of class. When I leave the classroom and then I see them like talking outside, I'm like, yes. They're connecting over now their journey of learning a new paradigm of music. And, we're helping them stay connected with each other and like creating a shared experience for them to then, take into the future. It's so awesome.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much for doing that, and keep up doing all that great work. Thank you for
Thank you.
taking the time.